In order to do an evaluation of your work and that of a peer, you have to go back to the origin of the assignment. And so our very first self and peer assignment that's to be assessed comes from here in class 3, where we did line value, simple and compound shapes. So you can see here we have the icon indicating self and peer assessment, and in order to access that we have to click on the link to go inside the actual assessment, and it gives you a breakdown of the project. There's also a couple of links here to videos, this one included, that kind of walks you through the process of submitting the work and also of evaluating the work. So you can see down here that it's got my evaluation for me and an evaluation for one of my peers. So I'm just going to do my own evaluation, but what applies to mine also applies to the evaluation of your peers. So I click on that, and it brings me into a list of questions. The number and the nature of questions, of course, will vary depending on the thing being evaluated. So we know that we have 2 questions, and oftentimes each question might have one or more evaluation criteria that I want you to consider when you're doing this. So for question 1, the main question is, are the layout and the typography correct? So I gave very specific direction for the size and the font to be used, and you can check that against the assignment itself. And I'm looking, it was set in bold, sans serif, and it's roughly at the size that was required, and I'm pretty happy with that. It's centered as was requested, and so I'm pretty satisfied that everything looks good there. Criteria 1, so here's what I was talking about. In the first instance, it's talking about layout and typography. The first criteria for question 1, if the size and orientation look correct as per the example, then award 2 points. If the size is correct but the orientation is tall or portrait, then award 1. This should actually say tall instead of portrait, then award 1 point. If neither are correct, award 0. So we're looking really at the orientation of the layout, and looks like I've got a little extra graphic there. I don't know where that came from. But without a border being around this, it's really difficult to assess. So I'm going to go with the layout looks fine, with the exception of that last little piece there. And so the sizing and the orientation both look fine, so I'm going to award 2. Save and on to the next criteria. Are the layout and typography correct? Now, at any given time, I can avail myself of this thing called model response, in which case it will show me the actual example. You can see it here, and you can see that it has, rather than a portrait, it has a landscape orientation, so that means it's wider than it is tall. And you can see the typography clearly centered in the middle of all of that, and it's in a bold sans serif typeface. So oftentimes a model response will be provided for you to serve as a basis of comparison. All right, so are the layout and typography correct? So there are 2 criteria here for us to consider. Criteria 2, if the type has been set centered at the top of the page and is 18-point Arial bold, as per the example provided, award 2 points. If the type has been haphazardly placed on the page, then deduct 1. If the type is in a font other than Arial bold, again, you got to refer to the sample, then deduct 1. If the size of the type is not 18 points, so more or less keep referring back to the sample that was provided back here in the model response. So we're comparing this submission to that of the model response. So for criteria 2, if the size is not 18 point, then you're deducting 1. If 2 or more mistakes have been made, award 0. 0 is the lowest mark that you can award here. So I'm happy that everything was done well there. So I'm going to give it a full 2 marks. And the next thing is considering the principles of design. There are, you'll see here, 6 criteria to consider. In criteria 1, does the composition use at least 3 primary shapes? An ellipse, a rectangle, rounded rectangle, or polygon? Well, it would seem that my composition here has only used ellipses. So if the minimum of 3 primary shapes has been used, then give a score of 1. Otherwise, score 0. So I can't allocate the points here. So I need to, in this case, it's an all or none. There's not an in-between kind of score as we had in the previous questions. So I can't give this one the allocated points, so I do not check this off, and I save and go on to the next criteria. So the next criteria is, does the composition use lines of varying widths and styles? Dashed, dotted, beginning and end arrows, double lines, decorative lines, anything like that? If so, award the point. Otherwise, award 0. Well, I haven't used any lines in there, so I cannot allocate the points. Save, and I move on to the next criteria. Criteria number 3. Is there at least one compound shape in the composition? A shape built using the addition or subtraction of a variety of shapes using either the Shape Builder tool or the Pathfinder palette. If it has, then award a point. If no, keep on going. So I can tell right from here, there is no compound shape. It's just 3 separate ellipses. So I move on to the next criteria. Number 4, does it include the use of a radial and a linear gradient somewhere in the composition? Award 2 points if both are used, 1 point if one gradient is used, and 0 if no gradients are used. Well, in this case, I've applied 3 radial gradients to my snowman here. But I have not included a linear gradient. So in this case, you can see this is a range of points, and I can only give it a 1. You can't give fractional or decimal equivalents. It's either got to be 0, 1, or 2. Here, it's probably worth me putting a little feedback there. You only had radial gradients. A linear one was also required. And I move on. Now criteria 5. Does the composition actually exhibit the principles of design stated in the title above the graphic? So what am I saying here? Balance? Does it have balance? Yeah, I would say it does. Does it have symmetry? Yes, it definitely has symmetry because it's got, if we put an axis down through the center of this, it's symmetrical. And is the repetition? Yes, of a sort. We have the same shape repeated 3 times. So in this case, I would award it the full 2 points. If there's no title, then award a 0, because that means that the person hasn't considered which principles of design they're using. If it does exhibit the principles stated, then award 2 points. If there's a principle that is evident in the composition that has not been accounted for in the title, then award 1 point and explain what they missed in the feedback comments area down here. I'm going to give it full marks. Save and move on to the next criteria. So this is the final one. Criteria 6, is the composition monochromatic? In other words, black, white, and grayscale. If so, give it a point. Otherwise, 0. So I can allocate the points here. And I've now saved, and I can now submit that work, and I've performed my evaluation. So you can see it shows the points that have been allocated, and now I need to go on and evaluate the work of a peer.